The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Robert Crais. I'm Bruce Southworth, mystery book reviewer for Publishers Weekly and the Drood Review of Mysteries. Robert Crais is the author of the successful Elvis Cole mystery series, the most recent of which is Voodoo River, published June of 1995 by Hyperion. Others in this series include Monkey's Raincoat, Stalking the Angel, Lullaby Town, and Freefall. In addition to being an author, he's been a television scriptwriter, working on such series as Hill Street Blues, Beretta, Miami Vice, Cagney and Lacey. I'm probably forgetting a couple. He's also worked on a highly acclaimed miniseries called Cross of Fire, which details the development of the Ku Klux Klan in the 20s, I believe it was.
Yep.
And in addition to his scholarly pursuits, he's a pilot, a gourmet cook, long-distance runner, and he has the enviable distinction of living among 14,000 books in the collection. So welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Bruce, it's fun to be here. Thanks.
You said at one point that all of your books deal in some way or another with an aspect of your life. Voodoo River deals with a young woman who has just recently discovered that she has been adopted, and she's looking for some information, not so much to find her birth parents, but for some medical information and so on. And I understand that you were adopted as well. Was that sort of the genesis for this particular story?
Absolutely, yes it was. I'm adopted. It was never an issue for me, no big deal at all. I never had any desire for a reunion with my birth mother, never fantasized about it. I mean, my mom and dad were my mom and dad, end of story. A couple of years ago, though, I went in to see my doctor for a triannual physical, just your basic physical, and he discovered something that might well have developed into a health problem, and it became imperative, I think, at that time for myself and for my wife too, for me to try to find out what was up the bloodline family tree. And that got me to thinking quite a bit about that particular search, because those documents are all sealed. You often have to hire a private detective to uncover these things, or various agencies. And it was the conflicted feelings that I had about that entire issue that I think led me to create Voodoo River.
One of the interesting sensations that I had when Elvis Cole is talking to Jodi Taylor when she's arrived. Now, a lot of the action, most of the action takes place in Louisiana,
right
outside of New Orleans, Baton Rouge, so on. That as she's about to meet her birth mother, there's a conversation that goes on between them, and it almost seems like, in a sense, she's an alter ego. That's kind of the way I thought about it. It's kind of like the discussion, do I want to, do I not want to? And I was wondering if that was that tension that was coming out there.
Absolutely. It's kind of interesting to me. I found that I created two characters in the book, each of whom to mirror a certain side of my feelings on the issue of a possible reunion with my birth mother. I created Jodi Taylor, who's I guess the genesis of the story. As you said, she comes to Elvis and she hires him ostensibly to find her birth parents. And though she starts off saying, I have no wish for a reunion, the more she learns about her birth mother, the more she wants to know, until she finally reaches a point where she wants to have a reunion with this person. And I also created Lucy Chenier, an attorney in Baton Rouge who works in adoption issues and who is herself adopted, but she doesn't have any interest in a reunion and learning anything about her birth parents at all. And I think these two women were sort of the Greek chorus for me, as it were, as I worked my way through the book using Elvis Cole as a guide to sort out how I felt about these things. Because when I was pursuing my own search, I wasn't sure what I wanted. I wasn't sure if I was comfortable with the thought of a reunion. I didn't know if a reunion would be necessary or even possible. How would, if I had to meet my birth mother, how would I relate to her? What would I call her? How would she relate to me? That particular scene you referenced, where Jodi Taylor finally does meet her birth mother, I think was probably the most intimate and personal scene I've ever written. It was very difficult to write. It took me a very long time to write, and I wrote it many, many, many times to try to get it correct. And there were days, I'll tell you, there were days when I was sitting at the word processor. I mean, tears were streaming down my face, trying to mine that ore deep down to get that scene just as honest as I could.
There's, I don't know, it's a strange sensation when you're reading dialogue to hear essentially what in my mind was a sort of a quiver in a character's voice. You know, just that sort of emotion coming out, and that's the sense that I had in that particular scene. So I mean, it came across very, very, very honestly, I think.
Thanks.
So,
thanks.
Is it an interesting experience trying to investigate yourself, though?
It was interesting. I'll tell you, it was also fun too, because there was a real world stuff. You know, there are certain things that an adoptee can do to learn your past history. And I did those things, and they weren't particularly informative. You can go back to the state. The state is allowed legally to release to you what's called non-identifying information. That's just reports that were taken by social workers at the time, and they give you whatever information there that doesn't identify the birth parent. Past that, they can't do anything. And at that point, you become, you either hire a detective or you become a detective. And before I sought professional help, I decided to play detective and see what I could find. I knew the town of my birth. I knew when I was born.
And this sorry to interrupt. This is also Louisiana. This takes place.
This is Louisiana. I was born in Louisiana, raised in Louisiana, and that's why this story, Voodoo River, takes place in Louisiana. I felt it. I absolutely had to go back home to tell this story. You know, it's fiction, so I could have created Jodi Taylor, the adoptee, and I could have had her from anywhere. I could have said it in Minnesota. I could have said it in Canada. She could have been from any place. But this is my story, so I really wanted to go home where I grew up and bring Elvis there for the first time and really deal with the place and the whole rhythm of Louisiana and Cajun country. So that's what I did. And as part of the research, it was funny. For a couple of weeks, I went back and I got to play Elvis Cole. I guess it was goofy, but you know, I was sincere, and I think it had dividends in the books. I went back. I knew where I was born. I went back to the little town. I went to the library there, just as Elvis does in the book. I spoke with people. You know, my version of undercover, because I didn't tell them who and what I was doing, for fear that if you go back and you're saying, here I am, I'm this adopted kid, I'm trying to find my birth mother, people might have a tendency to view you as a nut, or God knows what could go on. Also, in the small town environment, I don't think the police are particularly friendly towards strangers coming in and snooping around. But I went to the libraries. I dug up old phone books from the time. I went to every area high school, looking through high school and junior high school class yearbooks, checking names, checking photographs. What it really taught me is that I needed professional help. but it was fun and interesting, and I think I applied all those things to the book.
I think it would be fascinating. Now, throughout all of your books, you've had some really kind of offbeat characters. One that I remember, although I can't remember his name, unfortunately, is sort of a thug, for lack of a better word, who I remember he and Elvis driving around the streets of, I think it was New York at some time, listening to cassettes, and they were talking about music and whatnot, but at the same time he could turn very easily and just punch somebody out or shoot them or whatever. In this book, I mean, he's sort of an odd character in that he's likable, but he's despicable. And In this book, one of the odd characters is this elderly woman that Elvis sees who's constantly spraying Raid all over the place. And are these the kinds of people that you run into in life and in this kind of an investigation?
Sure. In fact, you're talking about Martha Guidry, the Raid sprayer. Martha is actually based on one of my dear relatives.
Ah.
Yeah.
Does she know who she is?
Yes, she does.
Oh.
Yeah, we had a great laugh about it, and but I grew up with people like that.
Interesting.
It was an odd place to grow up.
Well, now you did something odd also once you've
done many odd things.
Well, it sounds like it. Yeah. And we don't have time to cover all of them, so we may have to go into 3 parts here. But you up and joined a carnival, I understand, when you were young. And what kinds of things? Well, what motivated you to do that? I guess
I fell in love with it. Where I grew up, we had something called Bill Haynes Century 21 Shows in Midway. It was a touring Midway that worked East Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Western Florida. Bill Haynes was a real low-class dive of a crummy Midway. Everything was greasy and rusted, and there was a coot show, and there was one of those great, metal globes that the guy in the motorcycle got in and rode around upside down, and all of these things. There was a freak show. There was a long Midway of concessions, ball toss games and all these different things. So it came to town, and it set up at the local airfield, and I went to it, rode my bike, and I thought, this is great. This is just the most wonderful place in the universe. I had no taste even then. And I thought, wouldn't this be cool to just hang around here? And I got to talking with what these places would do is they hit a town, and then they look to the people who own the different concessions and whatnot, look for local hires to because they can't afford to carry people.
Right.
And I met a woman. She was a retired acrobat. Her family had been literally in the circus for over 100 years. She was multi-generation. She had a ball toss concession, and she offered me a job working there, setting up the cats, picking up baseballs. And I said, this would be great. And I started working for her, and they were getting ready to hit the road. And I said, Jesus, I don't want to quit. I want to keep doing this. So I went home and I said, can I keep doing this? And they said, sure, why not? And I stayed with them for a while until my carnival life came crashing down around my ears.
Okay. Well, this brings me to.
I knew where it would bring you.
Yeah. So we have to ask. In the information I've been able to gather up, there's a story about the human cannonball, bringing your career to an end. So what's that all about?
It's a true story. We had a human cannonball, and every evening he would put up his cannon at the end of the Midway, and he had the net 60 feet away, and he would climb up on the muzzle of the cannon, make a big spiel about how much black powder he would pack into it and how dangerous the act was and all of this stuff, and people would gather around and he'd do the deal. So I was fascinated. I thought it was pretty neat, this whole Evel Knievel kind of thing working. And one day when it was down and I was just hanging around the Midway before the people started coming, I went back through the tents and I inspected the cannon, and I found out how it's really done. Now, Bruce, I'm going to tell you this as a secret. You must never tell anyone.
Okay, we'll have to shoot all of us here. Okay.
Exactly right. Everyone here must die. Well, of course, it's just a big spring. It's a spring-loaded catapult, and there's no powder in there. It's just a gas charge to make it look like there's smoke. Well, I was naive and stupid even then, and I just felt such a sense of outrage. This man is lying. I thought, oh my God, what a surprise! This man is lying to these people every night. I was so filled with moral outrage that the very next night, when he was making his spiel and standing on the muzzle of the cannon, and I'm going to risk my life, and there's thousands of pounds of black powder, and we could all die, it could explode. I stood up on one of the end trucks at the end of the Midway, over, so I was above the crowd too, and I started screaming at the top of my lungs, fake, fake, done with a spring. And people started looking at me, and they're looking at him, and they're looking at me, and I'm yelling, he's lying to you all. I felt, like Kevin McCarthy in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I'm trying to So the guy looks down and he sees me and he recognized me, and his face just flushed red. So he finally finished his act. I got tired of my thing and I jumped down and he finished his act. He comes swinging down out of this net, and the crowd's breaking up, and I'm beating it back through the crowds between the midway. And the next thing I know, from between two of the concessions, I mean, this claw, like Rodan the monster, reaches out, grabs me, yanks me back. 14 years old, it was the scariest thing I ever saw. Here comes, you know, the longest knife that has ever been made. And he said, "Kid, if I ever see you around here again, I'll cut your head off." And that was all I needed. I was stupid, but at that moment, I got real smart real fast, and that ended my employment with Bill Haynes' Century 21 shows in Midway. I went home.
You went home.
Yeah.
And thus began a new chapter.
And these are the origins of a writer, what can I tell you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's plumbing the depths. Now, you went, how did you go from that to writing TV scripts? I mean, that seemed like a kind of an almost immediate transition.
You know what? But you know what? I think it's indicative of I've always been drawn to fantasy. The carnival is fantasy. You know, my love of movies, my love of books. I've always been a reader. Anything, you know, magazines, comic books, novels, nonfiction. You know, if it would take me to another place, I loved it. Somewhere in there, I started telling stories. You know, I started writing little stories and making my own books. I was drawn to it the way a firefly is drawn, or a moth is drawn to a candle. And by the time I got to college, I guess I was proficient enough at it to, as I wrote short stories and submitted, some of these things sold. And this made me think, my God, you dummy, you can actually make some money doing this. Maybe there's even a chance you can make a living at it. I was a big fan of television at that time. And I thought the choice for me was, should I go to New York and be a serious literary short story writer, or should I go to Hollywood, make a lot of money, and have fun? So I went to Hollywood. And
I'm surprised.
I learned a lot of lessons from the Human Cannonball. And that's, I think, is the natural progression. That's how I think it ties in. I wanted to be a part of the creation of fantasy worlds. And I went out to Hollywood to write TV.
Now, I understand that you learned script writing in an interesting way, or at least one aspect of your learning of that craft was interesting, that you would go to, I know there's little back alley garages that sell scripts and photos and all that
when
sort of thing.
When I went to Los Angeles, I knew no one, there were no contacts, none of this, no Uncle Maury, head of the studio, wasn't any of that. I knew nothing. I'd never seen a script, didn't know what a script looked like. I went to a bookstore on Hollywood Boulevard that sold secondhand scripts for, I believe it was $2.50 a pop. Bought a couple, went home, pulled them apart, stuck the pages in my typewriter, measured all the margins, saw where everything lined up, studied the scripts, studied television, studied my favorite shows, really broke it down, trying to teach myself, teaching myself how to write an hour script. And that's what I did. I started writing some, and it happened real quickly for me. The second script I wrote sold, and I became a TV writer.
I'm curious about the series that we mentioned at the outset, Hill Street Blues, L.A. Law, and so on. I mean, they've got ongoing multi-layers going on all at the same time. When you submitted a script to those types of shows, were you able to kind of tell something that you wanted to tell, or did you have to really just fit into the flow of what they were doing and kind of buy into their program, as it were?
Well, you have to, clearly you have to service the series. You have to fit into what they want. When I worked on Hill Street, I was, in addition to writing episodes for it, I was also on staff there. I was a story editor. And all of those shows were gang written. You know, there would be 4, 5, 6 of us in a room. And it was very collaborative. We would all work out the stories. We would all pitch out ideas. Once we had all the storylines, A, B, C, D, whatever it was, worked out, and we would sit there on a chalkboard. We would write them all out each step. when those were worked out, we would divide it up. You know, you take Act 1, you take Act 2, you take this, you take that. It was fun, and I think I did nice work during those days. But it's not your work. It's not intensely personal. It's a team effort. I think that, in fact, that sense, that feeling on my part, is ultimately what led me back to prose and finally into writing the Elvis Cole novels, because I wanted to I wanted to write the themes and explore the themes that I wanted to explore, and I wanted to write about the world as I saw it in my way. So TV was great fun, but definitely it's collaborative.
I have kind of two questions floating at the same time here. One is, did that kind of structure and means of putting together a story affect the way you create a novel? In the sense, I mean, are you very structured when you work the novel?
Yeah,
block everything out?
Absolutely. First, I think working in television, when and where I did, helped my novel writing immensely. Helped my dialogue, helped my pace, helped my structure. It also taught me some things. And to this day, when I write novels, as in TV, you have to outline everything. You have to, you know, as I was describing about Hill Street, you come up with all the steps, all the scenes, everything in advance. That's the way I write books. I outline extensively. I know everything that's going to happen in the book before I write the book. Clearly, there's some flexibility. Sometimes things change, but I outline extensively. So I think that directly came from my involvement in television.
The other thing that I'm wondering if kind of ran through this as a sort of a thread was, how to put this, Elvis Cole seems to be, one of his main motivations seems to be that he becomes fairly indignant and acts in a variety of ways to clear that up when powerful people sort of abuse that power and put other people who aren't as powerful under their thumb, who just take advantage of them or oppress them or whatever. In a way, that sounds like your human cannonball. You know, he was just taking advantage of his situation.
Moral outrage again, sure.
Yeah. So, was that something also that kind of flowed through those? I mean, all of those types of shows really seem to deal with moral outrage in a lot of cases. I mean, they dealt with trying to make things right and carry things through.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly that's an interest of mine. I think that's sort of inherent, though, in crime fiction. Crime fiction tends to be about right and wrong, good and bad. You know, there are good guys and there are bad guys, and some sort of judgment seems in order. Clearly, in the Elvis Cole novels, that's definitely one of the patterns that I've created for myself. Elvis is a good man, a man of virtue and ethic. And I think he takes great offense when others violate his sense of morality.
Yeah, I remember reading a comment that you made that Elvis is the person that you would like to be.
Yes.
And I can see a great kinship. And I'm curious, where is Joe Pike then, perhaps, an element of your darker side, or where did he come from?
Yeah, Joe is my darker side. When I was working, you know, these books are sort of self-help. You know, these are self-therapy books. Elvis and Joe, I think of as yin and yang. I think of Elvis as my lighter side. He's the optimistic part of me. He's the part that's trying to make the world a better place. And then there's Joe. Joe is more complex, I think, than many people realize because he's so internalized. But Joe I think, is the wounded part. You know, there's a reason that Joe is the way he is. There must be. Otherwise, he's simply a cartoon. I think that somewhere in the past, Joe was greatly wounded, greatly hurt. And the only way he could take care of himself was to shut it all down, just the way he has. He's walled off from the outside world. He's now in almost what I would describe a pure survival mode, which is why he's so intensely focused on whatever the task is. So that's also what makes him so very dangerous. And Joe then I see is the dark side of Elvis.
It's interesting because he also seems to have a sense of humor. I mean, that comes
Clearly,
through in a way,
Yes.
which in a way you wouldn't think of as a person who's completely shut off the
Right.
world. You know, having a sense of humor is very important, I guess, for survival. But also the loyalty and the friendship that exists between Joe Pike and Elvis is very, very intriguing. And it's fun to, in Voodoo River, when they're taking a very long run together, it's real interesting just kind of eavesdropping on the discussion that goes on between the two, because you realize how close they are.
Yeah.
And you know, everybody should read the book just to to find out about all of those things. But
you know, I often think that Elvis Cole is really Joe's only connection with the rest of the human race. You know, Joe has another life. He owns a gun shop. People work for him. He dates Ellen Lang. But it seems to me that in some way he needs Elvis Cole to anchor himself to reality.
it's also interesting how he sort of comes in like the 7th Cavalry, you know, pretty much. I mean, things get completely blown out, out of hand, and then he's having to come in and not really rescue, but it's sort of when, to use the term again, the moral indignation reaches a boiling point, you know, and Elvis just can't, we're going to have to do something about this, whatever the situation is.
You know, I do that, that recurs in the books, and I do that on purpose. Because I think one of Joe's purposes in this little reality that I'm creating with these books, it's very important for Joe to take care of Elvis. You know, as I was saying before, it's like Elvis is his anchor. And I think Joe is very protective of Elvis. So there's a sense that I have that no matter what Elvis is up to, somewhere out there in the shadows, Joe's going to be there. And Elvis knows that deep down, but Joe is going to be there. So when the opportunity occurs, almost in this Deus Ex Machina way, Joe Pike is going to be there to help his friend out.
I think that's great. Unfortunately, we've essentially run out of time ourselves, and I want to thank you very much. The new book in the series is Voodoo River by Hyperion. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Bruce, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Take care.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.